Hello, I'm Chris Williamson, and welcome to this No2Nato, No2War discussion. We're going to be talking about the state of the modern media, the quality of contemporary journalism, and the level of censorship that's being applied in the present era. It's said that the first casualty of war is the truth, and NATO's proxy war in Ukraine is a classic case in point, where the truth about what's really happening in Ukraine has been expunged from the airwaves and erased from the pages of all the corporate media's outlets. The foreign affairs and war correspondents who work for the corporate media these days are little better than stenographers for NATO. It was Winston Churchill who insisted that in wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Or to put it another way, a bodyguard of liars, made up of corporate media hacks and venal politicians. Julian Assange's proposition was the perfect antidote to Churchill's maxim when he said, if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. Julian also asked about the average death count for these journalists who peddle the lies to promote and justify war. And that's why he accused them of being war criminals. And that's why Julian's still languishing in Belmarsh prison, awaiting extradition to the United States, where he faces a 175-year jail sentence for exposing war crimes and denouncing the liars who try to cover them up. It's to the eternal shame of the journalistic profession that not only have they been virtually silent about Julian's plight, a number of them have even ridiculed him and peddled lies about him. So as NATO pushes us closer and closer towards World War III, telling the truth has never been more important. That's why I'm delighted to be introducing three tribunes of the truth today, namely George Galloway, Kit Clarenberg, and Patrick Henningsen. George hardly needs any introduction. His oratory, his tenacity, and his humanity are legendary. He's a leader of the Workers' Party and was a former Labour MP before winning a seat for the Respect Party in the 2005 general election. And 7 years later, he secured a famous by-election victory in Bradford. George was the most vocal and articulate opponent of the illegal war in Iraq. And he's one of the most principled people I know. And he's someone who understands and observes the true meaning of solidarity. Kit Clarenberg is an investigative journalist exploring the role of intelligence services in shaping politics and perceptions. He's also the editor of Grey Zone UK and writes for a range of other publications. He was recently detained at Luton Airport and had to endure a lengthy interrogation by counter-terror police about his political views and his reporting for the Grey Zone. He hadn't done anything illegal, he just factually reported on the national security state's own violations of domestic and international law. But as George Orwell said, during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act. And Patrick Henningsen is an author and founder of the independent news and analysis website 21st Century Wire. He's also an investigative journalist, and I first met him back in 2019 outside Belmarsh Jail, where he spoke out about the outrageous treatment of Julian Assange. George is going to speak first, and he's going to set the scene and say a word or two about another real journalist, Gonzalo Lira, who was arrested and detained last month by Ukraine security services for the heinous crime of reporting the truth from Ukraine. So over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Chris, Patrick, and Kit, and Shan for the technical directorial side of things. I'm very glad to join this meeting, and I would first of all like to pay tribute to No2Nato's last public meeting, which by my rough calculation has now been watched by more than 300,000 people. 300,000 people watching a public meeting is one hell of an audience. In fact, if I'm not wrong, it makes last meeting of No2Nato, No to War the biggest anti-war meeting since 2003, February 15, the greatest of all political marches of any kind in Britain. But of course, we failed to stop the war. And so far, we're failing to stop the war in Ukraine. But that won't stop us from trying. The presence on this platform of very fine journalists and, if you like, counter-current narratives is itself a two-sided coin. We're here because we'll never be on the BBC, but also we're here because it's increasingly less important to be on the BBC. The curve, if you were to draw it, of our non-personhood in so-called mainstream media matches almost perfectly the downward slopes of the curve of the credibility of that mainstream media. And I firmly believe that whilst the new world of media is struggling to be born, the old order is very definitely dying. And of course, to complete the triptych, we are definitely living in a time of monsters, but we're also living in the time of very healthy infants. I don't agree with everything Tucker Carlson says by any means, or even 50% actually of what Tucker Carlson says. But the percentage, whatever it is, on which I do agree with him, are the most important issues of our time. And he gave birth just last week to his new show. Can't call it a show because Fox News are suing him for breach of contract. Having sacked him, they now want to silence him. But his appearance on Twitter in a 10-minute monologue to camera has drawn possibly the biggest television audience of its kind in television history, rapidly approaching 100 million people on Twitter watched a speech or a monologue by a journalist that was once the most viewed on Fox News, to be sure, but that most viewed was an audience of some 3.5 million. Compared to almost 100 million. I predict it will reach 100 million, which tells you something about the medium and the message. The fact that so many people are now tuning into the likes of the mother of all talk shows, my own show, the week before last, it'll be down this week, waxes and wanes, but it goes between 1 million and 3 million. In fact, the week before last, the audience, all or in part, in other words, the whole show or a clip of the show, was watched by 3,028,000 people, which indicates a thirst amongst the public for the truth. Chris, you put it very well in your introductory remarks. The bodyguard of lies, the bodyguard of liars, as you put it, is thick. Of course, it's a thick bodyguard. It is many serried ranks, but people are seeing through those serried ranks in numbers hitherto unprecedented, and we can count them on the view counters of the like of Patrick's show, Kit Clarenberg's appearances, the Grey Zone, the mother of all talk shows. If you were to add up if you throw in Russell Brand and others, you are talking mass audiences now for the truth. And that's one of the reasons why the pretense of impartiality, the pretense of freedom of the press is being so with such gay abandon tossed overboard by the mainstream media. Once upon a time, they tried to disguise their actual role in British society, I'm sure also in American society. They pretended to an impartiality that they now no longer pretend. As I say, none of us will be invited onto the mainstream media, none of us at all. And if we ever appear in the mainstream media or reported on in the mainstream media, it will be only to give vent to venomous attack, an attack framed by, I use the word advisedly, framed by the security services and the state. And what happened to Kit Clarenberg has not even been reported in the mainstream media. And yet, it could scarcely be of more grave concern. I mean, it's one thing strangling us on social media. It's one thing putting false labels on us. One thing algorithmically distorting our audience and potential audience. It's another thing when 6 police officers are waiting for you at the foot of the steps in Luton Airport. 6 in a crime wave in London that the Met cannot get to grips with. They spared 6 of London's finest to meet Kit Clarenberg at the foot of the steps at Luton Airport, and then proceeded to interrogate him, quite illegally in my view. I'm no lawyer, but from what I've read from Kit of the kind of interrogation, it struck me that it could not possibly be justified, even under the very, very wide rubric of the anti-terrorism laws under which they were interrogating him. I mean, asking a journalist what his views are on Rishi Sunak has to be beyond the scope of the legislation, unless it was your contention that Kit Clarenberg wished some harm on Rishi Sunak, which self-evidently he does not. I doubt if Kit had any views on Rishi Sunak. If you ask me my views on him, I'd have to look him up to see who he is. But for a police officer to politically interrogate a journalist, and moreover a prize-winning journalist, one whose journalism is finding a bigger and bigger readership audience in the world, is a very grave matter. Not quite as grave, of course, as the plight of Julian Assange, who I'm losing count of the number of years that Julian has been a prisoner of one kind or another. A prisoner of first of all, false allegations. And let's not forget, en passant, Chris, if you'll forgive me, those that were in the House of Commons on their feet demanding that Julian Assange be extradited, yes, extradited to Sweden to face what they called serious charges of a sexual nature, charges which were later completely dropped and are now utterly discredited. But starting then until now, Julian has effectively been a prisoner. The world's greatest journalist, a prisoner. Where? In England, which is never done telling people how it is even prepared to go to war for freedom, for the freedoms that our forefathers and mothers struggled for in times gone by and defended in the teeth of Nazi fascist tyranny that was once just 28 miles from our coast. So we are in, as Charles Dickens put it, it is the best of times and it is the worst of times. We are living in a tale of two verses, two dimensions, one of which is dark indeed, but the other is increasingly bright. I'd only add one thing before contributing to the discussion with the others, and it is this. The recent explosion, we can now say for certain it was an explosion, at the Kakhovka Dam has certainly brought out the worst in our leaders and illuminated something they would much rather have kept in the shadow. First of all, it illuminates the absolute step in which they march, the concert in which they all perform their parts. It illustrates how we haven't Brexited at all, how British foreign policy is absolutely identical to European Union foreign policy, except where it is even worse. And it illustrates that our political leaders, and on my own show on Wednesday night last, I singled out James Cleverly because I saw his comment. There may have been others. James Cleverly lied through his teeth as the Foreign Secretary of Britain when he said that Russia had blown up the Kakhovka Dam. This allegation will fare no better than the allegation that Russia blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, an allegation which is no longer made, which has now been dropped. Even the United States agencies, through their agents in the New York Times and the like, make it clear that it was not Russia, but they say Ukraine, which blew up the Nord Stream pipelines. This allegation about the Kakhovka Dam will not fare better than the original allegation that Russia blew up the Nord Stream, or that Putin flew a drone into the Kremlin, practically into his own bedroom. Nobody makes that allegation anymore. So we're left with only one of two possible conclusions. One is that James Cleverly is not very cleverly, or that James Cleverly is a liar, a brazen, open liar, in a lie that will quickly be seen to be a lie by the great majority of our public. Thanks for allowing me these opening remarks. I'm looking forward to hearing the other statements and, as I say, participating in the discussion.
Thanks very much, George. Just before I bring in Kit, though, I wonder whether you might just say a word or two about Gonzalo Lira, who has appeared on your show on a number of occasions, and as I was saying in the introduction there, has been arrested by the Ukraine security services. I think it was on the 1st of May. I mean, he's been a beacon of truth right in the heart of Ukraine. In many ways, I was surprised there'd not been action taken against him sooner. But I mean, are you concerned about his fate, George?
Yes, I am, and I'm concerned that Kit Clarenberg, too, having been a guest on our show, fell into the hands of the Metropolitan Police. Gonzalo Lira has suffered a fate far, far worse, even than Kit's, in that we now have no sight of or knowledge of where and how Gonzalo Lira is. Now, I have very profound disagreements with Gonzalo Lira on many things. But his truth-telling from the front line in Kharkov, in Ukraine, has been of enormous importance. And even if one disagrees with the conclusions he draws from the reporting that he has done, you'd have to be a pretty sinister person to want to see him led off with machine guns pointed at his head by the SBU, the secret security forces of the Zelensky regime in Kiev. We had his father on the show, a very eloquent 80-year-old man, movingly describe how neither Gonzalo's family, children, nor his father have any knowledge as to whether or not he is still alive, and if he is still alive, if he is being tortured, where he is being held. And the American embassy, which has consular responsibility, duty to Gonzalo, because he is, of course, an American citizen, was born in America, is a citizen of America by birth, are virtually completely ignoring the appeals of his family for knowledge. So yes, indeed, Gonzalo Lira has to be added to the litany of these casualties of truth that you described, Chris, right at the beginning.
Yeah. Well, I mean, our thoughts are with Gonzalo, obviously, and his family. Let me bring in Kit now. Thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening, Kit, particularly after that awful ordeal that you had to undergo at Luton Airport last week. I wonder whether you might just say a little bit about your work and speak about, if you feel able, your recent experiences at the hands of the Metropolitan Police.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the two are obviously inextricably linked. I mean, I think that my experience on the 17th of May, it speaks to how dangerous it is to challenge ascendant NATO, British and American narratives on what's happening in Ukraine. I have never ever, at least to my knowledge, spoken out in favor of war in my life. I have never ever cheered the murder of civilians or the destruction of infrastructure or the slaughter of soldiers on either side. We are entering a very, very dangerous period in time. The information space has never been so weaponized as it is now. It's quite remarkable, and I think that this has implications for all of us. It really does, and anyone voicing any degree of skepticism or cynicism or criticism about what's happening in Ukraine, dissenting from mainstream government-approved narratives, is in very serious danger. Not just of social media censorship and online ostracism, but potential arrest. Or at the very least surveillance and harassment by authorities. I mean, you bear in mind that the overwhelming majority of the questions that I was asked by police when I was stopped for 5 godless hours at Luton Airport were related to my thoughts on the war in Ukraine, my thoughts on the Russian government, my thoughts on the Ukrainian government. Yes, and Rishi Sunak, as George pointed out, I mean, I had to respond that, well, he doesn't make me think. He's just another puppet in an overly expensive suit. But we are now in a context where voicing any dissenting opinion is legitimately dangerous. We might not be subject to the full-blown Belmarsh treatment, a la like poor Julian, but there is almost a kind of 1984 chilling effect. The results. I mean, as Orwell wrote, you didn't know whether a telescreen was watching you, but you did act as if you were being watched at any given time. I know a large number of people who are genuinely frightened. They live all over the West, of voicing anti-war, anti-proxy war, anti-escalation opinions, because not just because of social or professional ostracism, but because they genuinely fear that they'll get visited by police. It's quite extraordinary how quickly and how subtly we've reached this point. I don't think there's any coming back. I think that as there are reports of the Ukrainian counteroffensive having commenced at long last. After lots of pressure and bullying, in the Western mainstream press, it doesn't seem to be going very well. a large number of Ukrainians, largely conscripts, dragged from classrooms in the street and nightclubs and skiing resorts to face this relentless onslaught of Russian artillery, are being killed in large numbers. The Western supplied vehicles and weaponry is being destroyed systematically. We are heading towards a potentially catastrophic defeat, not just for Ukraine, but for NATO. And in that context, power is going to need someone to blame. And the easiest people to blame will be the anti-war, anti-imperial pacifists who all along have been saying this is awful and we need to stop it. There is a national security bill which has already headed through Parliament and is ready to become codified legislation, which would apply the same kind of rules and standards, if you can even call them that I was held under at Luton Airport, to the entire population. So when I was hoovered up by the goon squad at Luton, I was given a bit of paper that said, well, you're not under arrest and you're not under suspicion of having committed a crime. However, this means that you do not have the right to silence, and you face arrest for not answering questions or not handing over the PIN codes to your SIM cards or your bank cards or your memory or your phone or your tablet. Just absolutely shocking stuff from the country that invented the right to silence, and so that this is going to apply it more, the same precepts more widely. Again, the devil's in the detail. In one section of the various pamphlets on my glorious detention I was handed, it stated that I have been held because they suspect I might be a state threat acting on behalf of a hostile foreign power. And it added in parentheses, for this test to be met, an individual does not have to be knowingly or wittingly assisting a foreign power. And that foreign power does not need either to know that this person is acting on their behalf. It's quite some conspiracy when the two conspirators do not know they are working together. And that is the non-existent bar for someone being investigated, being arrested, being questioned about their political views. I was grilled at length. It felt like the most unpleasant job interview or first date I've ever been on, with two detectives whose names I couldn't learn. They referred to each other by their call signs, asking me how on earth it was that I got into doing what I do. Leaping from studying politics at university to national security reporting is actually, not that much of a vaunt, but in their minds it was, and I had to justify that. And I, of course, in the weeks since then, I have been laying awake at night thinking, well, were they trying to probe whether I was recruited at some point by a foreign intelligence agency or some kind of, hostile foreign actor? Did that convince them? Are they grilling into this now? Am I going to be dragged up on, oh, you sent this person this sum of money, or you received this sum of money from this person, 5 years ago? What was the purpose of that? We are already there. And as I say, I think that in the event of a catastrophic defeat for Ukraine, which does seem increasingly inevitable and likely, they are the Western powers are going to want to control the narrative and suppress inconvenient facts even more. The present media narrative, which the grey zone has, just by pure token of factual reporting, done so much to shatter that Ukraine is this virgin, innocent, liberal democracy, which has been, for no reason other than kind of Bond villain-esque Machiavellian bloodlust, invaded by the evil Russians, and Britain and America as believers in the international rules-based order, supporting small, young fledgling democracies, is providing with the arsenal necessary to defend their lands and their rights and their freedom. I mean, it is intelligence insultingly, blatantly false on its face, but our reporting detonates that. And another thing I'll add as well is, propaganda is not only about what you are told, it's what you're not told, right? So I was asked in my interview, do you not see how your reporting might be in the public interest, but it's not, it might be interesting to the public, but it's not in the public interest, right? And they asked whether I felt that I was, furthering Russian war aims and undermining British national security by reporting on what I've reported on. A laughable proposition, but made all the more perverse by the fact that the Grey Zone is the only English language outlet, as far as I can see, which has consistently warned English language readers that this conflict, this proxy war, is going to create a huge amount of blowback, which puts Europe and North America at huge risk of mass casualty terrorist attacks carried out by neo-Nazi forces. Okay, so in late 2022, the British Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee published a report which stated openly, and it was heavily redacted, but you can very easily fill in the blanks, that there was a huge risk of returning fighters from Ukraine who had fought alongside far-right forces carrying out terrorist attacks, and there was no mechanism in place to monitor these people upon return. It was sounding the alarm then, ignored by the media. At the start of this year, 2 members of Atomwaffen, a fascist neo-Nazi terror group, which openly calls for insurrection reaction against the American government, 2 of its leading members who had trained alongside Ukraine's notorious neo-Nazi Azov battalion were jailed for plotting terror attacks against electricity infrastructure in Baltimore. This is a majority black city, not that far from Washington, D.C., funnily enough. And they specifically were doing this because they wanted to deprive the city of heat and light during a very harsh winter, in the hope that this would cost lives, right? And this was ignored by the Biden administration. Not a single official commented on it. And we here at the Grey Zone, with our limited staff and limited resources, are warning people that it's a matter of when, not if, that there is a mass shooting or a bombing attack. My good friend and colleague Alex Rubinstein last year reported on an Italian media investigation into how an Azov-linked neo-Nazi cell near Naples had planned to burst into a shopping centre and open fire on shoppers, had planned to carry out bombings on civilian targets. This got zero coverage in the Western media because, yes, it messes with, it fundamentally undermines the narrative. We are there warning people that you need to prepare for this and you need to be asking serious questions of your allegedly, elected representatives. But then I'm the one having to answer questions about whether my reporting undermines national security and puts the public at risk.
I mean, what you're saying, Kit, I mean, it's quite terrifying in reality. And I mean, I think, this absurd assertion that, you're somehow a threat to national security. Indeed, this was a pretext in some ways that was used by politicians to remove my parliamentary pass. All former members of Parliament have a pass to go to and from Parliament if they wish. I've never been back to the godforsaken place, I've got to say, since I lost my seat, but the principle is quite important. And they cited, the fact that I present a programme on Press TV about Palestine, but also the fact that I had said that Zelensky was backed by literal Nazis. And, that was seen as unconscionable. I mean, how does the environment in which you're operating now, Kit, compare to when you first started out on the road of investigative journalism?
I mean, it's never been so hostile, and I mean, you see this with. I have seen people who are, full-blooded, undeniable, Russophones, who have been at this for years, stoking xenophobic conspiratorial fears about the threat of Russia. People like Mark Galliotti, and also, the BBC's first disinformation reporter, Mariana Spring, a more accurate title than was surely intended. I mean, anyone who steps a foot wrong, quote unquote, on the narrative is branded, a Vatnik, Putin apologist, useful idiot. I mean, this includes, as I say, this includes people who have, multi-year, if not decade-long histories of engaging in, openly xenophobic rhetoric about Russia, spewing all manner of lies about the nature of, modern, Russian society and politics. You can never be quite as frenziedly, manically anti-Russian enough to fit the narrative. You never can. And I mean, nuance is as much as it existed before, which is to say not very much. That's completely out of the window. And yes, this is resulting in people getting added to kill lists. It's resulting in people getting banned and shadow banned, on social media. I mean, in the context of Mitrovets, which is, a Ukrainian government, as I say, hit list for people who offend Ukrainian authorities. My dear friends and colleagues Anya Parampil and Mate were recently added to it. I mean, fast forward to earlier this year, there was a major tech conference in Portugal to which the Grey Zone was invited, and at the last minute, because there were Ukrainian officials, including Zelensky's wife, in attendance, our invitation was rescinded. Now, this might seem fairly minor in the scheme of things, but there is an ongoing battle, and a particularly aggressive one, to ensure that the public only sees one very specific, very limited narrative of what is happening right now. And as I say, Julian Wropser, who is a German reporter who was once at one stage called Jihadi Julian for his appalling coverage of the Syrian conflict, supporting regime change and all the various CIA and MI6 backed jihadist groups raping and pillaging the country. He is pretty much embedded with Ukrainian forces, and he has pointed out when they have failed spectacularly and vast amounts of them have been killed. This has been sufficient for him to receive death threats on social media. I mean, and this is someone on the pro side, right? And we also live in this perverse informational milieu where the sole question that you are allowed to ask and indeed answer is, oh, well, what do you support further arming Ukraine? And then if your position is no, for a variety of reasons that it's perfectly legitimate to oppose that, then, well, you're letting Russia win. I have been involved in anti-war activism for a very long time. I have been writing about the plight of the Palestinian people for over a decade now. Not once have I ever heard a single Palestine solidarity activist ever propose shipping tanks and killing apparatuses to Hamas or to the occupied territories, and never have I ever heard someone who opposes such a measure say, oh, well, you're letting Israel win. I've never ever heard that, but what it is the recurrent cul-de-sac argument to paint anyone who thinks, well, we should stop doing this and we should just calm it right down because the risk of World War III and all-out war between the West and Russia is gaining with momentum, every single day. I recently, I think it was earlier today, there was a newspaper report about how NATO member states are considering sending troops formally to fight in Ukraine if Ukraine isn't given NATO membership. Now, this might even be lobbying, but what an insane proposition! And this is not much more than a year after Biden said the idea that we're going to send ground troops, let alone send Ukraine offensive weapons, is lunacy.
Incredible. Well, let me bring in Patrick now, if I can, and just wonder, Patrick, whether you might give us the benefit of your thoughts on what George and Kit have just said, and maybe offer your reflections on how the BBC and other mainstream media outlets are reporting on Ukraine.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chris, for a chance to speak. I remember, there's a lot of different ways we could look at this, but something that's really kind of at the forefront of my mind was when I realized back in 2012, when there was an effort by the government, a ham-fisted effort, but an effort to remove press TV from the airwaves in Britain. And there was never a straightforward explanation as to what it was being removed for. But at that point, there were a lot of sort of big efforts namely by the United States government previously to attack Iran or to position Iran as a potential target in war. And it just, with the proliferation of English language foreign channels, starting like say 2007, RT got into the foreign English language market, then Press TV around the same time. There was a few others. China has had a couple of projects similar to that. and all to varying degrees of success, but tremendous success by Iran with Press TV globally in the soft power game in the English language market, and RT undeniably incredible success. And you realize at that point, if there was a war to break out, and imagine if that is one of the potential sources of information from the other side in English language on a global media scale to either Freeview Box or YouTube or satellite or cable in the US, and how important that would be, and how incredibly dangerous that would be if there was no other counter narrative coming from an actual live war zone. And so imagine if, we got a taste of that with Iraq, with embedded reporting, really a controlled media environment in the Iraq war. And you realize that how important that would be. I mean, imagine if the BBC was completely shut out. For a British audience, if they, how would they feel about the BBC being completely shut out of a foreign theater? Ditto for CNN and the major US networks as well. How would that feel? You'd feel like you wouldn't have all the information to be able to make some kind of an educated evaluation of what the true state of the conflict was. And so when I saw RT not only be shut down in the UK, in the US, in France, but also the URL removed, rt.com, that's a new level there. A major threshold has been crossed there to start removing URLs, because once it could be rt.com today, it could be the gray zone tomorrow. The whole URL could be banned from the EU or 21st Century Wire or something like this. And so you can now see the actual results of this. Okay, if you speak to people in Parliament, Chris, I'm sure you've had your share of conversations. Now imagine, and people say, well, they're just anti-Russian. You literally have a situation in the United States in government, in the British government, in some European parliaments, where elected officials do not have access to the statements made by the Russian foreign minister, are not up to date with the position of Russia, or listening to Russian defense briefings or official states' position speeches. And then they're carrying on. George commented on Mr. Cleverly not being so clever. It is literally that case right now. They are working in a low information environment where they are marinated in the West. It's policymakers in the West that have the power of how this war is going to be prosecuted. They're working on a low information environment, and they're making decisions. They're dragging the country and other partner countries into a conflict deeper and deeper, and they do not even have any idea. They cannot articulate what the Russian position is. They cannot articulate the true status of the battlefield situation. If you read British intelligence, what they release to the public, it is almost a comedy show. If you actually go back and look at some of the past public releases from British intelligence, it's so politicized. Nobody wants to be on that side where they're saying something that might, quote, hurt morale or hurt the war effort, or damage the Ukrainian morale or NATO's morale. We are literally at war, but in everything but name. And so it's absolutely fatal in the information space to not have counter narratives, to not have alternative narratives and analysis, because it means that our elected officials cannot, and as a public, we do not have any informed consent with regards to how deep and how perilous the slide to war is. So that's to me, that's the most important thing. It's not merely about censorship now. It's much bigger. And it's in terms of the social media censorship, I could go, quite deep on that. I was also in the Twitter files. I found out after the fact, and that was a little bit of, I wasn't so surprised. I was a little bit surprised just to see it, but to see my name and my account on a blacklist as a suspected Russian, a Russian agent or Russian account, and to realize that was being shared by the FBI the NSA, the DA, Department of Homeland Security, and then shared with big tech platforms to put me on a kind of banning list, which was successful on a number of platforms. But myself, many other journalists, many other activists, bloggers, and people like this, and to see how well coordinated this was. It started off with countering Russian disinformation after the 2016 election. And then it was repurposed to countering election disinformation, and then countering COVID disinformation, and then vaccine disinformation, and now disinformation about the Ukrainian conflict. Okay, back to the Russian imperative. Okay, so this is the whole of society approach. Kit was kind of alluding to this. He said we're in a very dangerous place in history. The information war, the battle for the narratives are so important. You can now see where the real concern is from government, who believe that everything is the battle space. This is the whole of society approach. Twitter is a now official election infrastructure, according to multiple U.S. agencies. And I would venture to say that they have the same programs in the UK. They just haven't been exposed yet to the degree they were with the Twitter files. Same at YouTube, same at Google, same at LinkedIn, same at Instagram. They're all working more or less on a shared platform with troubled users that they share. Blacklists are passed around between government, the private sector, big tech, civil society organizations, NGOs, the Center for Countering Digital Hate. These types of NGOs have all sprouted up to work together with the mainstream media, with big tech, with government, and even university departments and the DFR labs, the Atlantic Council, people like this, these NGOs are all working in Congress with a gigantic censorship apparatus. And that's not even to talk about the Bellingcats of the world that have been, cutouts that have been basically bolted onto mainstream media, who operate very similarly to the 7th Brigade in their recruitment, the ways that they recruit people to work for them. And now you have NAFO. NAFO is the largest online troll army ever in history, and they have basically taken the 77th Brigade model, which is some people are kind of in the boiler room and the rest are volunteers, taken from professional capacities, working in finance, working as lawyers, working in politics, working in media, and on their spare time, they're sort of doing their national service, if you will, doing online information warfare. Okay. So this is the battlefield, the battle space that the head of the British military, I believe the previous head of the British military talked about, is that there is no war, there is no peace. It is a continuum. We're constantly in a state of conflict. And there's no beginning or end to the war. It's just a constant state, a spectrum, if you will. This is the way, these are in the papers that are presented at organizations like RUSI, okay? These inform the policy going forward. So as Kit said, it doesn't stop. It's full on all the time. Everybody is considered potentially an asset of foreign influence. And even if you intend to or not, if your narratives, if you're a blogger or you're a social media user or a journalist, if your narratives happen to be, if you share the same narratives as RT.com, you're then peddling Russian disinformation. Forget about whether it's true or not. Forget about whether it's factual. And I will contend, and my thesis on this is that this is the road for disaster for Britain and for NATO. That the reason they are losing, let's be honest, they are losing badly in this proxy war. And one of the reasons is they will continue to lose badly because they're working on a low information environment on this side of the Iron Curtain, okay, the new Iron Curtain. And there is no benefit other than a deeper quagmire for NATO prosecuting this proxy war, and a total disregard and a completely discarding of any diplomatic solution. So there's no military victory for Ukraine. or for NATO. And then there's absolutely, they precluded any diplomatic solution. So what are we left with? What is this? Just an open-ended, slow grind of a proxy war, where our politicians have not thought it out. They're not opening dialogue with the other side. They're all dug in and too far invested to turn back. And whole political legacies, are so much political capital sunk into this narrative of Russia bad, and the West has finally discovered the concept of international law, which is laughable after all of the various egregious violations of international law, all the conflicts that we could just rattle off. And so even for myself to have a conversation about UN Charter, we hear about Article 51, the right to self-defense, but nobody's talking about Article 1, which is the right to self-determination. And if you look at the Donbass as a case study, and I've had this dialogue and we published some excellent pieces on this, the Donbass qualifies under a UN Charter for statehood. It is a much stronger case than Kosovo. In fact, there's no comparison. They've done everything by the book. This is why Russia did not intervene militarily immediately. The Donbass had to stand on its own 2 feet. Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics had to form their own militia, protect their borders and their people, and form their own autonomous government, because they were cut off from Kiev in what's called lustration, but also physically cut off. Utilities, Kiev's no longer paying civil servant salaries and things like this. So you relinquish your claim to these territories, and you open up the possibility for autonomy plus a violent civil war. It absolutely qualifies under UN Charter, okay? And in much better case, mind you, than many other examples of this as well. So what you had was, with Yugoslavia, the West, or NATO, shattered the Helsinki Final Act, that there would be no change in the European borders. That was null and void at that point. And this opened the door for Crimea's independence referendum, which wasn't the first referendum Crimea had in its history post 1989. Okay, so this opened the door for that, and also for the situation in Donbass. For myself to have this conversation at any level is akin to being a Russian shill or Russian disinformation. No, it's absolutely an important conversation that needs to happen, because eventually it's going to happen after a military conflict, or it's going to happen to avert a further conflict. But it has to happen. But it's not happening in the West. And the ICC indictment against Vladimir Putin and another Russian official with the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a completely spurious, baseless case. There's nothing, it has no merit whatsoever. It is a ridiculous charge, okay? And Putin being the first, I'm making a joke, of course, but Putin's the first white man ever to be indicted by The Hague. It's all African, black Africans, and he's the first. Milosevic was across the road in the special tribunal for Yugoslavia. So they finally gone after a U.S. target state that wasn't in Africa, and indicted Vladimir Putin, which again precludes international negotiations, because if you can't have negotiations in Switzerland because they might be bound, or whoever's a signatory to The Hague, if they're hosting any talks, or it then precludes diplomacy. That's why they indicted Vladimir Putin. So these are a few issues that we need to have, and we're not having these discussions in mainstream. This should be on the BBC. This should be in The Guardian. These should be high-level discussions in Parliament, in Washington. It's not happening. This is not good. That's my concern, Chris.
No, indeed. I mean, and you mentioned in your contribution there, Patrick, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. And if I might just abuse my position in the chair to give a plug for Palestine Declassified, because we've just recorded a program exposing, who's behind the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, what their real agenda is. So I'd urge anybody watching this to look out for the Rumble link and just take a glimpse of that, because it gives an insight really into the way in which the modus operandi of these sorts of organizations, which, as you say, have been springing up. Of course, another one, and you talk about this issue about countering so-called Russian disinformation, and there's an organization called the Institute for Statecraft, and an offshoot of that was the Integrity Initiative, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, Patrick, that was receiving millions of pounds of public money from the Foreign Office and from the Ministry of Defence. And whatever you think about, counting Russian disinformation, that whole notion, whether that's fair or not, I've obviously got grave reservations about it for the reasons that you've already set out, Patrick. But what we discovered was that they were diverting a lot of that money to attack the official opposition when it was led by Jeremy Corbyn. And I was asking questions in the House. That's where we were able to uncover the fact that they were being given these multi-million pound annual grants. But when I was seeking to get further information, the flow of information stopped, and I was the response from ministers was, well, they cited national security as the excuse for not providing that information. And what do you make about that, Patrick? The fact that the public money, I mean, literally multi-million pounds are being thrown at these sorts of organisations to allegedly counter Russian disinformation, but then it's also being used for other, in my opinion, anti-democratic purposes.
Yeah, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, there's another one we'll add to that list as well. But the Integrity Initiative, hugely embarrassing. That exposure was hugely embarrassing because it gave the public a glimpse behind the curtain to see the coordination of mainstream media journalists, the biggest names from the Times, the Guardian, etc., and the sort of the ringleader being people like Bill Browder, these high profile dissidents working with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So this was, it was a network, if you will, and a lot of it was planting stories, anti-Russian stories. It's very important in this current conversation because that was in the run-up to this current conflict, and you could not have the public support for a proxy war unless you could build up an anti-Russian sentiment within the population. That was achieved through the 2016 election in the U.S. to convince the public that, or at least half of America, that the Russians helped put Donald Trump in power. Okay, and we know from the Durham report now, the latest release of the Durham report, that idea or that sort of storyline originated in the Hillary Clinton campaign, and then made its way through the FBI, and then quickly became institutionalized through the whole of government. And this opened the floodgate for funding for all sorts of initiatives, some we know about, some we don't know about. The Integrity Initiative would be one of those types of initiatives, or a sort of a think tank, if you will. What it really is, it's about operationalizing propaganda and coordinating it on a level, and also to get political outcomes from that. And we also found from the Integrity Initiative that they actually managed to thwart the defense minister in Spain through sort of a fake news defamation campaign that was hatched right out of the Integrity Initiative itself. Yeah,
that was Pedro Baños, wasn't it? Wasn't that Pedro Baños? Yeah, yeah.
That's correct. And the transatlantic nature of this, it speaks to the fact that this was a kind of a cutout for NATO. So coordinating between Canada, the United States, the UK, and the European partners. And so this is really important because that level of coordination right across NATO or the G7 countries, as an example. We also have to look at, Theresa May, the rapid response mechanism at the G7 in, I believe it was June of 2018, I believe, or around there, when Theresa May was, I might have the dates wrong, when she was prime minister. And that mandated that in the G7, for any important foreign policy story of consequence, all the countries had to streamline their narrative. The messaging had to be completely the same. So this is why you see very little in terms of interesting pushback or any challenges regarding the sort of situations we're in right now between France, between Britain, between the US. No dissenting views allowed at all. Everybody has to be on the same page, and that means the media is going to be, the mainstream media is going to be pretty much on the same page as well. So everything's completely in lockstep.
Yeah, no, indeed. Well, listen, for the last sort of 20 minutes or so, let's get George and Kit, if they're still with us, back up on the screen. Just have a roundtable conversation. I'm not sure, Kit, we might not still have Kit with us now. I think he may have had to shoot off for another engagement. But perhaps, George, if we could maybe just start the round robin conversation by asking you and getting Patrick's views as well on this, is when and how did it all go so wrong? Because, I remember back, and as I was saying, you were the most outspoken and articulate opponent of the illegal war in Iraq. And I mean, you couldn't really turn the television news on without seeing you being interviewed virtually. You were a kind of ubiquitous figure. And as you were saying, I think, George, in your contribution, people like you, people like me, Patrick, Kit and so on, we never get invited now, or very, very rarely anyway, to speak. And when we are mentioned, I think you made this point. I mean, the only time I've been mentioned in dispatches, as it were, in the corporate media over the last sort of 3 years or so since I left Parliament, it's been very negative stories. Mind, there were plenty of pretty negative stories when I was in Parliament as well. But why and when do you think it all went so wrong, George, in terms of the ability of these contrary voices to the prevailing establishment narrative? When were they sort of spiked, as it were? When were they cancelled, do you think, and why?
Well, that's one of the fronts, and I'll turn to it. But hearing you talk about the Integrity Initiative and your role in their unmasking reveals, as it were, another front. You see, if a country has a parliament, and it's a parliament even vaguely worthy of the name, then the opportunity always exists for even what they call a maverick member of parliament. The best in my lifetime was the late Tam Dalyell, a very close friend of mine, who from the 1980s, from the miners' strike, the Falklands War, the war and sanctions on Iraq, and many other things, was, if you like, a constant source of irritation to the state, which would otherwise have been able to go about its dirty business in the dark. And someone like Tam would be in what you and I will recall very well, the table office, that for non-parliamentarians is the place where you go to table your parliamentary questions. Tam practically lived in that room, and the very, very clever and helpful PhDs that worked there behind the desk, they saw their job as helping the member of parliament table his or her question in a form that would be impossible for the minister, for the department, for the government to deny the information. So you might come in with what to your uneducated eye looked like a fair, kosher parliamentary question, and they would explain to you that if you just change this word, that word, substitute this for that, the minister will not be able to claim that this is a matter of national security and therefore we're not answering it. And I recall those days very fondly indeed. But that requires there to actually be in the parliament at least one dissident voice. And what we've now reached, as far as I can see, I don't pay as close attention to it as I once did, but as far as I can see, there is not a single member of parliament in the entire House of Commons, for the first time in all history, someone who is systematically working to expose and unmask the holes, the mistakes, or the venality of the official narrative. I used to, in my tours for people of Parliament, when I was a member there, pause at the statue of Charles James Fox, whom I always described as the greatest of all British parliamentarians. Charles James Fox, whilst a member of Parliament, openly sided with the American colonists in their incipient rebellion, later revolution and victory over the British Empire. And on the day that France, the people of France, executed their king and queen, tabled a motion congratulating the people of France on their beheading of their king and queen, and looking forward to the day that the same fate would befall all the crowned heads of Europe, presumably including our own crowned head at the time. Now, we've gone from Charles James Fox to what? To literally zero dissent in the British Parliament. Therefore, no one's in the table office asking the questions that you did about the Integrity Initiative. The clerks are not required to exercise their PhD minds to find a way that will force the minister to disgorge information, because nobody's asking for that disinformation. Statements are made at the dispatch box, pronunciamento of great moment, and no one questions them, never mind opposes them. This is completely new, Chris, in British parliamentary history. Even when I entered Parliament in 1987, there were dozens, scores maybe, of men and women of independent mind who would never have gone quietly into this dark night that we are now in. And during the Cold War, there were giant figures like Ziliakis, like Foote, Micardo, and others who were regularly, to use Patrick's phrase, regularly echoing the narrative of the other side, not because the other side owned them or paid them, but because that's what they believed. They happened to believe the same thing, in the way that any of us can agree that a motor car has four wheels. You're not owned by the Ford Motor Corporation if you state that objective fact. The situation has never been more dire on the parliamentary level, and that is bound to have its reflection in the mass media. If there's no one to interview in the parliament who's taking a different line, well, the media scarcely going to dig up superannuated members of parliament like you and me. They would far rather, it would be far more logical for them to interview Mr. or Mrs. X, who today in Parliament said this. So it's partly a function of that. It's partly also a function of the fact that we did quite well. You were kind enough to say I was once on the mainstream media virtually every day. And perhaps I did it too well. Perhaps I contributed daily to a growing number of people who already saw that this Iraq business was going to end badly. And even if they did not go all the way with me and others of us who did make it onto the media, they could see there was some sense in what we were saying. And nowadays, of course, I add in parenthesis, you cannot find anyone, anywhere, who will defend the Iraq war that was once a prevailing narrative as overwhelming as the prevailing narrative for Ukraine is today. I think I've told you, Chris, I went to a military function organized by Jim Davidson, the comedian, who has a thing called Care After Combat, which looks after these military vets that end up homeless on the street or behind bars in the jails. And I strongly support that organization. So I went to a military black tie do in Park Lane in the Dorchester Hotel. The man sitting next to me at my table was the then Conservative MP James Cleverly, now the Foreign Secretary, and Gavin Williamson, later then the Defense Secretary. They were at my table. George Robertson, former head of NATO, former Defense Minister in Blair. So that's the company I was in. Imagine their consternation when in the break, a line as long as you could see had formed of former and even serving military officers to get a selfie with me and or to say to me that they had once hated me, thought I was mental, but now agreed with me and now felt if only our leaders had listened to the anti-war movement at that time. That spooked them, Chris. That has spooked them, that we so comprehensively have won the day over the Iraq war. They're not going to let it happen again.
Well, we need to obviously then, push back even harder from outside Parliament, and I guess work hard to try and elect people who will ask these difficult questions. Will properly represent the people of this country, because they're not being represented at the moment. And what a state of affairs it is, George, in the country with the fifth biggest economy, that veterans who shouldn't really be put into these conflict zones in the first instance, but they are, as we know, and they then find themselves homeless on the street when we have enough resources in this country to not just eradicate street homelessness, but to actually eradicate poverty. And the situation, Patrick, in the United States, it's even sharper than that, isn't it? I mean, we're talking there about the wealthiest nation on earth, and yet the number of people sleeping under bridges, I don't think there's or Jimmy Dawson, there's not a bridge anywhere in the country where there are not homeless people living. What a dreadful state of affairs. I mean, how have we got there, Patrick? I mean, it's literally truly shocking. And, and it shocks me as well is, why do we put up with it? Why do people put up with it? What do you think, Patrick?
I think members of the military have always been cannon fodder, especially in the modern era. And I'd say the last great generation, the World War II generation, you could say the last great just war, where society would look favorably on people who were veterans of that conflict, and World War I before it, even though World War I is completely insane. Nonetheless, it was seen as a necessary conflict to, save the people of Europe and the world from fascism and tyranny, etc. The Vietnam era absolutely transformed that. And then the United States establishment went through various moves and reconsolidation and messaging and public relations to try to make sure that didn't happen again, even so far as to change the way that they actually prosecute warfare. And it was seen as that this was going to be, overwhelming air power, and then, fighting against rapid reaction forces, fighting against maybe lesser opponents. The United States has fought against countries that have no air defense for all intents and purposes. And this is why, and I'm going to say this is absolutely why, the U.S. NATO proxy war, or U.S.-UK NATO proxy war, because when we talk about NATO, it is effectively the United States and Britain. Everybody else is a junior partner. So the U.S.-British NATO war against Russia, using Ukraine as the battlefield pitch, is going horribly wrong because, there is nobody in the U.S. military establishment that has any experience fighting combined warfare, combined armed forces warfare. And so we literally don't have, NATO doesn't have such forces. No one has experience. There's not anyone on the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States that has any experience in anything resembling the current theater. So how would they possibly know? They're just throwing money at it. They're throwing weapons at it, recycling old Soviet era weaponry, turning it into scrap metal, and then backfilling it with brand new gear from the U.S., Britain, or France, or whoever. Germany as well has profited from this in their defense sector as well. Sweden profiting. So many other countries that have done well out of this, and it's turned NATO, which was meant to be a defense alliance. If you can argue it never was, but turned NATO into a protection racket. That's all it's become. It's a sort of take your local mafia, extrapolate that up to a global scale. This is what NATO has become. So the soldier, Chris, in that scheme of things, isn't worth a whole lot. And if you really want to look at this case study in Ukraine, which is horrific, look at the casualty numbers on the Ukrainian side, which is constantly being downplayed. Nobody wants to ever have a conversation about this. This should be a conversation on the floor of the House of Commons or Congress. Why? Because we will measure a conflict or a country's involvement in it against some sort of a moral standard. That's always been the case, but all of a sudden it's no longer the case. When you're talking about 100,000, 150,000, 200,000 dead, 250,000 Ukrainian dead, not Russians, Ukrainian. Okay, some of them being press ganged into military service. At this point, it becomes an immoral conflict. What's the ceiling for this? Is there an upper limit to this that the average British parliamentarian could take as saying this is enough? In America, the magic number is 56,000. That's the psychological barrier of the soldiers who died in Vietnam over a 10-year period. You're talking about 16 months. Ukraine losing the equivalent of what Iran lost nearly during the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, which is in modern warfare terms, post-World War II, that is seen as the most egregious death toll of a two-sided military conflict, Iran-Iraq, in 1980s. So this is eclipsing this on scale, orders of magnitude. Where is the limit? There has to be a moral limit, because if there's not, then we cannot pretend to act on the world stage as a honest broker in any way, shape, or form. It just can't be. And this is a moral crisis for the West right now.
Well, look, in Britain, in Parliament, as far as I can see, there are no voices on the Labour benches, and certainly not on the Government benches, who are calling for peace. Everybody's gung-ho for war. But look, war is a racket, isn't it? And when we launched No2Nato, I quoted from this book by Smedley Butler entitled War is a Racket. This was written back in the mid-1930s, and he set out how capitalist corporations actually profiteer out of war. I mean, George, are we led by psychopaths or what? Because, I mean, you mentioned cleverly, and I thought when you talked about a tweet, I think in your earlier contribution, I thought you was going to mention the tweet that he posted saying that that Ukraine's place is in NATO. It's like as if they seem, gung-ho for Third World War. I mean, are these people deranged? What's going on, George?
Well, they're definitely not James Bonds, as you've often heard me say. You and I spent enough time close enough to them, 10 feet from them, to know that they're more Austin Powers than James Bond. But of course, one assumes, although I never myself found it, that there is a dark heart at the middle of all of this that you and I would never get within 10 feet of. And therein may be the psychopaths. There are psychopaths, of course, on the political level, but most of them are vainglorious fools, I think, who have gone native I mean, you mentioned the government benches and the Labour benches, but the nationalist benches and the Liberal benches and the Green benches are all 100% for war. So we have, for the first time, I think probably for the first time in history, we have a unanimous parliament. And that, of course, allows whoever, wherever that dark heart is, to follow its agenda without fear of contradiction, still less fear of disruption to whatever their plan is. The more I listen to Patrick speak, the more convinced I am that we are no longer, in Oscar Wilde's words, two nations divided by a common language. We are not divided at all. The US and UK are the biggest danger to the peace of the world, and it is one of the great mysteries, which one day I hope live long enough to find the answer. One day we'll discover how it was that the European countries on the European mainland went along with a US-UK strategy which destroyed them, destroyed their economies, destroyed their place in the world, described what Macron called their strategic autonomy, which was minimal in any case, but significant. We talked about the Iraq War. France did not join the Iraq War. Neither did Germany join the Iraq War. But France and Germany are up to their neck in this war. And so one day we'll know how and why these European leaders were dragooned as junior partners, as Patrick properly put it, into a NATO war drive. I'm afraid the head of the snake is a now inseparable US-UK head of that snake, and venomous it is. It is our misfortune, for we cannot invent a new nationality for ourselves. We cannot live in an imagined place or an imagined time. We are doomed to live and work in that headspace of that head of the snake, and that means we have a very uphill struggle. But let's not lose hope, because we are making progress. The fact that 300,000 people watched our last meeting, and I hope the same number at least watches this meeting. We are reaching people. And as long as we have the space available to do it, we must keep on doing so. So I do hope this will become a fortnightly thing, Chris.
Yes.
A No2Nato meeting.
We certainly do need to look to ensure that we continue to provide that alternative narrative, because people are starved of that, aren't they, as we were saying earlier on in the mainstream media. But it seems to me, Patrick, maybe I'm a dreamer, I don't know, but I get a sense that there's a growing disconnect between the ruling, maybe there's always been a disconnect between the ruling elites and the wider general public, a degree of cynicism. But I get the sense that that's growing, and obviously we need to try to ferment that, as it were, with these sorts of discussions that we're having this evening. I mean, one of the questions I was going to put to Kit, if he was able to stay with us, is the role of the state in actually promoting fifth columnists within the kind of progressive movements. And of course, Kit famously outed Paul Mason, somebody who I was to some extent in awe of as a working class former bricklayer, and I remember getting to the point where I was sharing platforms with this guy who I used to watch on Newsnight. He was the economics editor on BBC's Newsnight, and I was quite impressed by him, I must say, and particularly his reportage of the Syriza movement in Greece. And then Kit outed him as someone who was working alongside, or indeed for, the intelligence services. This was somebody who had, portrayed himself as a progressive kind of lefty, as it were, for I don't know when, when maybe he'd always been an asset of the security service, I don't know, but certainly, he was in his latter period. How, in your experience, Patrick, and maybe George has got a view on this as well, I mean, how widespread do you think the use of these sorts of fifth columnists to sow division within, movements like ours, as it were? And we need to be mindful of that I'm sure there'll be people, coming in and seeking to divide it. Because I guess one of the things that the elites, that the establishment are most frightened of is a mass movement. This is one of the things, of course, I think, why they moved heaven and earth to smash the Corbyn project. But what it has been inspiring to see over in the States there is how the Rage Against the War machine has been uniting left and right, actually. I mean, we can agree where we agree, and we agree that, nuclear war is a thoroughly bad thing, and let's do everything we can to unite to stop that from happening. We can have disagreements on lots of other things, disagreements maybe on other areas of foreign policy, and certainly I'm sure domestic policy as well. But what's your sense, Patrick, as I say, about the use of these sort of fifth columnists to divide movements like ours?
It's a really good point, Chris. I noticed a change after the Iraq War. Talk about the big demonstrations and the level of solidarity against the Iraq War. It was really all-encompassing on the political left, and you probably had some libertarians in there. But so it was pretty solid, actually. It started to fragment. I noticed there's two issues. One of them was the war in Syria. Libya and then Syria. And what happened was successfully somehow, and the Palestine issue is central to this as well, because you saw a split in people, all parties that would support the Palestinian issue breaking up over Syria. It was very interesting. And I would put The Guardian and a few other media actors and then writers within those publications to work to split the left along identity politics lines. Okay, there's different ways that they've done this. One of them as well is with the Kurdish issue in Syria, very successfully as well, but also more broadly portraying this as an international cause for human rights or against authoritarianism. And if you look at the dynamic now, the dichotomy, the new paradigm, the new binary, if you will, in the Cold War it was communism and capitalism. Now they've successfully rebuilt this to now as authoritarianism versus democracy. So this is an outgrowth of the responsibility to protect doctrine. So the Samantha Power was the sort of emissary of this under the Obama administration. So with Syria, you saw all of a sudden the left being chopped up into little respective pieces, and the solidarity that was once there to oppose something like the Iraq War all of a sudden became mired in all sorts of little tangential wedge issues. And so, and then you also saw the support for Palestine also fragment potentially, because there was infighting between these groups. Stop the War Coalition all of a sudden transformed as an organization to the point where they didn't have a word to say about Julian Assange for years. All of these groups that Amnesty International, the National Union of Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, they didn't jump on the bandwagon to support Julian until his trial at the Woolwich Crown Court at Belmarsh Prison. At that point, it became a major media event, and they all felt pressured. And the Swedish sex case was basically dropped for the third time. Yeah. And they felt it was safe because, again, that's a kind of feminist issue. He became a sort of an evil character amongst feminists because of that. So you see how the media, through their power and politicians not wanting to touch certain issues because of various other wedge issues and tangential issues, no solidarity. So then where's the opposition at that point? It's not together. It's not solid. So I've often looked at this and tried to study and understand how this has happened over the last 10 or 15 years. And I think it's really important. And now we're seeing the culmination of it with Ukraine, where it's become the Democratic Party is now the party of war in the United States, and Labor in Britain, they're absolutely in lockstep. As you said, there's no plurality of opinion at all on this Ukraine issue in British politics. So this is the culmination, I think, of a long process that I think it's been very manipulated, and they've been very dedicated to the cause of basically subdividing and compartmentalizing political opposition.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, one of the most disappointing, and there were lots of disappointments that I had in that 2017 to 2019 Parliament when I was re-elected after losing my seat in 2015. I was the only MP, I don't want to kind of blow my own trumpet or anything, but I was the only MP that was consistently speaking up for Julian. I couldn't believe it that I was the only one. And I actually remember putting down a motion, and it was only signed by 4 other MPs. I mean, what an absolute outrage that is. It's truly, it did shock me, I've got to say. It really did shock me. And, I mean, even Jeremy, I think he had made one statement. I mean, and now, 1 or 2 more of them are speaking up now, but I mean, when they had a bit more influence, they were silent about it. Diane Abbott, who was the Shadow Home Secretary, I think she made one statement in the House when Julian was dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy. But
Chris, are they not terrified? They're terrified of the press, and if the media aren't on the politician's side, they don't even want to touch it.
No, you're right. Terrified. You're right. You're absolutely right. But my view has always been, and I know George subscribed to this as well, but look, if you've got a platform, if you have an elected platform, one of the things I was doing was touring the country promoting democracy inside the Labour Party. And I used to make the point, look, if you're a member of Parliament, don't treat it as a job or a career. It's not a job or a career. It's a privilege to be a member of Parliament. And your role is to represent the people that's elected you. And if you want a job or a career, go and get a job on a building site like I used to do, or go and work in an office or something. If you want a career, being a parliamentarian isn't a career. However, in reality, it is. That's how they treat it. And, they do very well out of it. But George, when Julian was going through the travails of the trumped up Sweden charges in Sweden, I can't remember how many MPs there were that were jumping on the Labour MPs as well, jumping on the bandwagon, signing motions, calling for Julian to be extradited. And as I say, I was literally the only one that was speaking up. But you've never suffered from a solidarity deficit, as I was making clear at the outset. And you certainly spoke out in support of Julian when it was difficult to do so. And one of the points I've always made is, look, solidarity only really counts. It's only really important when it's difficult, not just when it's easy. But that point, just George, perhaps in conclusion, because we've been going for nearly an hour and a half now, but I don't really want to say anything about that. But just the point that Patrick was speaking about there in relation to these state-sponsored fifth columnists that seek to divide movements like ours. What's your thoughts about that? And is it worse now than it's ever been, or what?
Well, first of all, I think it's been a tremendous meeting, and congratulations to those that organized it. Very, very high level of discourse. Lucky are the audience who will see this program and roll on the next one. Yes, even in the time of Charles James Fox, there were government agents infiltrated into the popular movements of that time. Nascent, Chartist type movements, movements against the deleterious effect of mechanization, of land enclosure, and so on. So there have always been government spies and agents deep in the population to report back, at least, on what is being said, planned, done, but also in the form of provocateurs to encourage courses of action that will ultimately discredit the movement that is being infiltrated, or make easier for the state to crack down on them, and so on. So I don't think it's anything new. I think there are more of them now, though I liked Patrick's dichotomy of, I think he said there's an officer class, a boiler room, but there's a lot of volunteers who will do the bidding of that officer class, even without asking for a wage for it. There are a lot of sheep around, and it only takes one sheepdog to corral a very large number of sheep, even onto the final journey to the abattoir. They tamely climb the ramp and head off to their death. But there are more of them now because the state is spending more money on it. When there was a Tam Diel or a Chris Williamson hovering around the table office who might ask, how is this all being funded? Then the state had to be a little bit more careful, but they no longer have to be careful. And again, as Patrick said, there's what we know about and what we don't know about. There is, after all, a gigantic secret vote to the British intelligence services, which none of us, first of all, it isn't even a vote. I never cast any vote in secret. Neither did you. They call it a secret vote. The only thing it really is a secret. How much money the state is giving to the security services, and with which and through which all kinds of crimes against our own people, never mind the people of other lands, might very well be being committed. So I think the state's putting more money into it. The social media age that we are now deeply into has, of course, given us vast opportunities that we would never have had before. When I started in politics, Chris, you had to run off a Gestetner machine.
Yes, I remember.
An A4 piece of paper, then cut it into 4 pieces, then go out onto the street and find someone gullible enough to take a leaflet off your hands. Now we announce at the touch of a button our gatherings, and very large numbers of people can attend. So these are great new opportunities for us. Therefore, they are great new threats to the prevailing orthodoxy, to the powers that be. And so the use of provocateurs, spies, and so on is obvious and probably growing. We must be as alert as we can, but not to the point of paranoia paralyzing us. After the triumph of the Russian Revolution, it was exposed that no less a person than Lenin's own private secretary had been an agent of the Tsarist bureaucracy and had reported everything that Lenin had ever done. And Lenin's response to it was, well, he did a really good job as the secretary. So if he was also informing the enemy, fair enough. And in the end, we triumphed and they lost. I think that's the proper attitude to it.
Absolutely. I mean, and I guess we should also maybe take it as a compliment as to our kind of effectiveness, really, that, you know, they're paying us the attention that they are. Listen, let me thank our speakers this evening, Patrick Henningsen, Kit Karenberg, and obviously George Galloway. Can I just also encourage people to check out the No2Nato website, no2nato.org. On there, you'll see a petition that we've launched, a parliamentary petition, calling on the government to invoke Article 13 of the North Atlantic Treaty to withdraw the United Kingdom from NATO. If we can get to 10,000 signatures, it will require the government to give a formal response. So it's important that we get as many people to sign that, I think, as we possibly can. We know what the response is going to be, of course, but it gives us another avenue to promote our cause and to expose the warmongering attitude of the government. If we can get to 100,000 signatures, then the backbench committee in the House of Commons can call a debate. They're not obliged to do so, but there could be a debate. Now, again, we know what the outcome of that debate will be, but what it does do, if there were to be such a debate, it gives us the opportunity for our supporters to put pressure on, to lobby parliamentarians, and it also gives us the chance to expose them as the warmongers that they are. So I'd urge people to check that out, no2nato.org. Also check us out on social media as well. We're on Twitter, again, at No2Nato. Give us a follow there and help us to promote the cause. Look, the establishment, the ruling elites, they've got power because they've got lots of access to massive resources. But we've got power if we stand together in solidarity, and that is a power that they are incredibly frightened of. And if the masses do link arms and stand together, we will be an unstoppable force. So I'd urge anybody who's not already a supporter of No2Nato to check out the website, sign the petition, and become a supporter, and to share this link to this discussion that we've had this evening, and watch out for further discussions that we'll be having. We're hoping to organise these, as George was saying, on a fortnightly basis. So thanks everybody for watching. This is Chris Williamson signing out. See you again. Cheers.